Hello and welcome to your free response tutorial by me, Ms. Charron. Today I am going to hopefully show you how to think through a free response for high school social studies classes, especially for 9th and 10th grades. In 9th and 10th grade social studies, your free response prompts will all follow the same format. And once you get used to breaking down the question and answering the different parts, you can get really, really good at these, and they can really boost your grades. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to go through the whole process with you, and I want you guys to pause your video after each chunk so that you can do the same thing on your end and follow along. On the right, I've made a sheet just to capture information. You are not going to get something that looks just like this. This is just a thing for me to show you how I'm thinking through stuff. Okay, so first, you look at the prompt. Unit tests and common assessments will have a prompt that looks something like this up here at the top. Evaluate the extent to which the Industrial Revolution was a positive development in human history. Cite 2 pieces of evidence in support of your thesis. 1 piece of evidence must come from a source. 1 piece of evidence must come from your content knowledge. The good news is this format will be consistent for the next 2 years of high school if you're just entering as a 9th grader. So once you get used to it, this part requires very little thought. Starting off, evaluate the extent to which up here is a really complicated way of saying judge how much. So judge how much the Industrial Revolution was a positive development in human history, a good thing. Was it not at all positive? Was it somewhat positive? In which case you'd probably give me 1 thing about it that was good and 1 thing about it that was bad. Was it completely positive? All of your evidence would be good things in that case. That's what evaluate is asking you to do. The first step for anybody though, and here is something that I'd write in pre-writing space, like on a scratch sheet of paper when taking a test, is just simplify what you're being asked because it makes it easier to think, right? So what you're really being asked here is, was the Industrial Revolution a good thing? And with that simplified question, I'm going to have a lot easier time thinking about evidence. Right? Was the Industrial Revolution a good thing? Was it completely a good thing? Was it sort of good? Was it not at all good? Was it terrible? When making a claim about this question, was the Industrial Revolution a good thing? You are going to need to support that claim with evidence from a source and with a second piece of evidence coming from content knowledge, which is to say from what you remember about the key points in class. The next step in our pre-writing process then is going to be to look at the sources that we've been given, because they will shape what you're able to write about, right? So before you start writing, you have to look at the sources. The best way to go about sources is to pick the one that you have the easiest time understanding and that you know the most about. There's no extra points for choosing the hardest, most difficult source. So go with what you know the best. Here I see a source that's a picture, and it's a picture of a graph, and it says urbanization going up over the past 500 years. So in my pre-writing space, I'd note that document 1 is about the growth of cities. If I didn't know what urbanization meant, this is not a document that I would choose to work with, right? But if I know that it's about the growth of cities and sorry, I have a cough, and I know about the connection between the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities, then I would definitely choose this one, and I wouldn't have to read the other documents as a result. If document 1 doesn't do it for you though, check out document 2. Document 2 is text heavy, right? So focus your attention if you are an English language learner, or if you have a hard time reading lots of text, focus your attention to the first couple of sentences. It usually gives you the topic. And indeed, It says, obviously you could suddenly travel long distances quite easily because of railroads. And if I know that the Industrial Revolution led to the mechanization of travel using machines to do work, and that the steam engine led to the creation of railroads, which made travel easier and faster, then this is a source that I could maybe write about. Okay. So document 2, it's about the speed of travel. If I've got enough to write from this, I don't have to look at document 3. If I want to jog my memory a little bit more, then I can keep going. Document 3 talks about the factory system replacing the domestic system. So the industrial era reliance on machines to do stuff in factories rather than producing things by hand or at home. As a result, work was organized to utilize power-driven machinery and produce goods on a large scale, which means using machines to do stuff made it possible to make more stuff. I know my vocabulary. I know that this is talking about mechanization and mass production, so that's what I would write in my pre-writing space. If I didn't know this vocabulary, though, I could still write about how machines made it possible to make more things faster. So I could note that in my source evidence. Moving on. I see at the end of the source, it also talks about some bad things about the Industrial Revolution, though, about how the boss not only owned the factories and the tools, but they also got to set the hours and wages for their employees, and how like people lived in really unsanitary neighborhoods and worked in horrible conditions, and it was pretty rough, right? So as I was reading, I highlighted evidence that I could potentially use so that I don't have to like look hard again when I look for my quote. And I'm going to think about like which of these things I know the most about that I could write the most about. I'm going to go with just mass production in document 3, just because it's really straightforward. If you can make more things with machines, then more people can buy more things, and that raises the standard of living, right? If I wanted to write about speed, I would have chosen document 2. It's really entirely up to you. Through this process, though, the other thing that has happened is I was reminded that there were some bad things about the Industrial Revolution, and maybe I want to write about them too. That leads me to the next step of this whole process, evidence from facts from class content knowledge. My second reason in support of my thesis statement is going to come from specific facts that I can remember from key points from class. And from class, I remember that child labor was super bad during the Industrial Revolution, and like basic working conditions were horrible. So from evidence from facts from class, maybe I'm going to write about that because that sticks out in my memory. Note that the part in document 3 that talks about bad things about the working class life, it doesn't talk about child labor, which is good because I want to talk about child labor. In order to get credit from this, I have to add information to what is given in sources. I can't just take like another quote from a source and try to pass it off as content knowledge. So be careful to not overlap too much with the sources if at all possible. And if you do, like, you just have to add a ton of information to what was given. So if I wanted to talk about urbanization, I could. I would just have to add information to what I can see in the source. Long story short, I have, through this process, given myself everything that I need in order to write a strong thesis statement. And in doing that, I have set myself up to very easily fill in the rest of my free response. A strong thesis statement is like the backbone of all of your writing. It is a guide to what should be in each part. And if you do a good job constructing it, the rest of the writing process is really kind of more of a fill in the blank thing. It's pretty easy. So the question that I was being asked, was the Industrial Revolution a good thing? I have evidence from the source that says, yes, making it possible to make things cheap and fast is a good thing. However, my content knowledge also tells me, like, no, I also want to write about one horrible thing about the Industrial Revolution. So that's going to lead me to make a somewhat claim. The Industrial Revolution was somewhat positive. Not entirely positive, not entirely negative, just one piece of evidence from each. That's my claim. Because my source evidence tells me it made mass production possible. My content evidence tells me it also involved child labor. Here I have my final thesis statement, and here's where the points come from. The Industrial Revolution was somewhat positive, is my claim, and I get a point if it's clear that I understand the question that I'm being asked. So that I include that I'm talking about the Industrial Revolution, for example, is important. Some kids start their thesis statement saying like it was somewhat positive, and without knowing what it refers to, that doesn't get a point. So you have to use proper nouns when possible. The Industrial Revolution was somewhat positive, point. In support of that claim, I have two reasons. My first reason I found in a source. It made mass production possible. And I'm saying that's a good thing. But my second reason comes from key points from class. It involved child labor, and that's a bad thing. Having now written this thesis statement, the rest of the writing process becomes fairly clear. I am going to support this thesis statement in 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is going to be all about source evidence, evidence from one of these documents. The second paragraph is going to be all about my content knowledge, stuff I can remember from class that's specific from key points. And in this case, it's going to be about child labor. On a test, these paragraphs won't necessarily be broken down for you by point like I've done here. Normally you just get like a line square to write on. Here I'm going to type where each individual point from that paragraph comes from so that you can see really clearly like the component parts of a free response, and you'll have a good idea of how to repeat the process on your own. At this point, you can pause the video, and if you're working on a free response, go ahead and complete your pre-writing space and thesis statement, and then rejoin the video so that we can talk through source evidence. We're ready to start writing paragraph 1. And paragraph 1 needs to start with a topic sentence so that your reader knows which one of these 2 reasons you're going to be talking about so they know what to expect. So first, because it's the first paragraph, one good thing about the Industrial Revolution was mass production. In this topic sentence, I've told the reader that I'm going to talk about one piece of evidence that I think is positive, and that it's going to be about mass production. I haven't added any information to what was already in the thesis, but that's okay because it's a topic sentence. However, every other piece of this paragraph needs to add specific information that you have learned in class in order to get additional points. The first thing you can do, and one of the fairly easy points to get if you've done pre-writing, is to just add in your quote. So here I'm going to look at my documents, and I note that it's document 3 that I'm quoting. So according to doc 3, citing that specific quote, or that specific source will earn you a point down the road. According to document 3, quote, work was organized to utilize power-driven machinery and produce goods on a large scale. I wrote the whole quote. You could copy paste if this was a computer. Note that I know what each of these words mean, and that's why I chose this quote. Please do not choose quotes that you do not understand. It is clear in the writing when that happens, and it's no good. Go for like low-hanging fruit. So I chose document 3. That was my quote. If I had chosen document 1, here's how to quote a picture. According to doc 1. In order to quote a picture, you just describe for the reader what you see without adding your own analysis. The graph shows urbanization rising over the past 500 years, and it goes up a lot after the Industrial Revolution. Right. So if I'd written something like this for a picture, that's totally fine. But we're going to go with document 3 for our response, so we'll keep this quote here. That alone earns me a point. So if you looked at a quote and you know it supports your thesis, always write down the quote. It's an easy point. Next, we have to add context or descriptive detail from class key points in order to make that quote meaningful for a reader who has not necessarily taken this class. Remember that your free responses are places where you are teaching somebody else information that you have learned, right? So we need to add information to make this quote clear and meaningful and put it into context. And we can do that in several different ways. So I will show you a few of your options. Number 1, probably one of the most basic options, is to rely on definitions here. If there's vocabulary that relates to paragraph 1 and you can give us a definition that you learned from class, often that will earn the point. This whole response is about the Industrial Revolution. So if you want to even just define that in the context of what the quote is talking about, you can totally do that. The Industrial Revolution was a time when people used machines to do work that used to be done by hand. That's an option, right? You could talk about what the quote is describing instead. So you could say, the quote is describing the vocabulary word mechanization, which is the process of using machines to do work that used by hand. Right, because I've connected this to the vocabulary word, I can get a point for that. You could talk about the factory system, right? Even if you don't know like the specific word for machines, say the quote describes the factory system, which means the growth of factories in cities that housed machines that did production. Okay, you can do any of those things. Other than definitions, a good way to go about adding context or detail is talk about short-term effects of whatever it is that you're talking about. So, you know, because of the use of machines to produce goods, the effect, right? The short-term effect of what this quote is talking about, people could afford to buy things like extra clothes that used to be luxuries because making them in factories is way cheaper than making them by hand. So that's like a short-term effect. Because of these machines, goods got cheaper and more people could buy them. Another way of adding context or description is you could contrast with like whatever alternative you might have in mind, and like just describe it in detail. So the quote's talking about after the Industrial Revolution, you could make things with machines and it was cheaper and faster. So you could talk about before the Industrial Rev, people used to live in the countryside and make what they needed hand. After, machines made that work much easier and cheaper. All right, so whatever you do for this adding context or description, as long as you are adding some definition, some short-term cause and effect, some descriptive detail that you learned in class, you are good to go. What we don't want to see is you putting information that was in the quote just in different words. That doesn't help anybody and that doesn't get you points. All right, so let's just leave that as my context. Before the Industrial Revolution, people made things by hand. After, machines made that work much easier and cheaper. We're ready to move on to reasoning, and reasoning is often the hardest part of free response writing for high school students. Reasoning requires you to explain the connection between these facts that you listed and the value judgment that you're making in your claim. You are asked to judge the Industrial Revolution. Was it a good thing or was it a bad thing? In paragraph 1, you're saying that it was a good thing, right? Because you could mass produce goods. So what is it about these facts that make the Industrial Revolution good? Explain your reasoning. In order to explain your reasoning and earn credit, you also need to add specific information from class. You can't just repeat yourself. You can't just state that this makes the Industrial Revolution good. You really have to flesh out that idea, which is why it's kind of tricky. In order to do reasoning well, you could talk about long-term effects of whatever you're talking about and why they were good. You could go deeper on the compare and contrast, like why it would have been bad to always have to make things by hand. As long as you're connecting the facts here to the claim, the positive part, then you should be okay. So like a couple ways of doing this, and probably the easiest way in my mind, is to talk about long-term effects, right? We just said that the Industrial Revolution made machines do work that made things much easier and cheaper. Well, what's good about that? Because consumer goods were easier and cheaper to produce, they became more affordable for common people to buy. Therefore, the factory system raised the standard of living, and that should do it. But if I want to be like extra clear how this connects, I could add, which makes this a positive development. All right, here I've added information from class that puts this part of the Industrial Revolution in a positive light. You could also write things like, before the Industrial Revolution, just add a lot of detail. Like, you had to be basically royalty in order to afford more than a couple of items of clothing. And people didn't really have very many options and there weren't very many cities. And, talk about why that was bad. If you've done all of this, though, you have successfully not only completed a paragraph, but you've likely passed whatever free response it is. You've gotten 1 point for the thesis claim. You've gotten a 2nd point for identifying evidence. You have a point for a quote that you use to identify that first piece of evidence anyway. If you can think of one fact that you can talk about or one definition that relates to the quote that you can write, that's a whole other point. That is for sure a passing score. And then if you can do reasoning on top of it, then you are golden. At this point, if you want to pause the video and fill out your own paragraph 1 with source evidence, please do so. If you're rejoining us, let me show you how to add another point to your score by doing literally no mental work and just writing one more sentence. In your thesis statement, your second reason for your claim involved content knowledge, stuff from class. And here you're going to talk about child labor, right? You need to introduce this second paragraph with a topic sentence. And you don't have to add information in order to get the point. You just have to write the sentence. So if you do that, you get a whole writing point for having two topic sentences and the specific source cited. So you could say, second, the industrial rev was bad too, though, because of problems like child labor. If you do that, you have a whole second point. I'm going to go ahead and copy paste the thesis statement down here so we can reference it when we're writing our second paragraph. For paragraph 2, what we need you to do is to teach your reader in detail something that you've learned about class that supports your claim. And we have chosen child labor. Right, so what I want to do is write a sentence about child labor, like as best I can remember a key point about it. So, during the Industrial Revolution, and here I have to add information. I can't just repeat that child labor existed. I have to like say something more. So, it was common for children to go work long days in factories to support their families. And actually, let's say in mines and factories, because that's true and I remember it. So we're teaching our audience something, right? During the Industrial Revolution, child labor occurred and in specific places, in mines and factories. And why? Because they needed to support their families. For a second point, I need to add even more information to that, kind of like we added context to the quote from the source. So what do we know about children going to work long days in mines and factories to support their families? Why did they do that? Why was this a bad thing? Tell the reader, right? And here again, you can give a definition if you need to. You can talk about cause and effect. You can compare contrast. So for example, before the Industrial Revolution, children worked in the home with their families in relative safety. During the Industrial Revolution, though, they went to work in factories and were often used to, this is something that most of my students remember because I describe it in detail because it grosses them out. Were often used to use their tiny hands to unblock stuck machinery. Often would crush those tiny hands. Bosses didn't much and were not responsible for their safety. Yeah. So paint a word picture, right? What was bad about child labor? I could also, instead of adding all that, I could talk about, you know, like people were moved from the countryside to the city and they lived in like horrible conditions. I could talk about the miners, like the kids who had to wake up at 4 in the morning to go to work in a mine. And so they ended up like deformed and hunchbacked and with black lung and all this gross stuff. The key really for this section is to pick something from content knowledge that you remember a lot about so that you can write about it relatively easily. The last step, as with evidence 1, is reasoning. And here again, we're not looking for you to repeat that this was a bad thing. We're not looking for you to restate your whole argument at all. What we want you to do is connect this evidence, these facts about child labor in the Industrial Revolution, to your claim about this making the Industrial Revolution only somewhat positive because these are bad things, right? So like what was bad about child labor? It sounds pretty self-explanatory, and yet we need you to add information here in order to give you a whole other point. So even though it seems like child labor is obviously bad, you need to find a way to teach me about why it's bad. And to do that, we can, as before, talk about long-term effects. We could talk about comparing and contrasting what life was like for these kids before and after. I'm going to go with long-term effects. I feel like long-term effects are easy for reasoning. So I'm going to say, in the long run, society made laws protecting children from this kind of abuse. Like we have, like you can't hire children to do dangerous work for one thing. And even if you could, we have laws that mean that employees have to be safe at work. Employers are responsible for people's safety, right? I'm not going to write that whole thing, but we'll go with this. Society is better now, in other words. We are better off now than the lives of the children of the Industrial Revolution were so horrible that society changed to protect workers more. While this is good for us now, at the time, it would have been awful to be one of those kids, which means that the Industrial Revolution has negative sides too, right? So I wrote more than ideal, but I've added information that I learned from class to earn a point and connected it to why I think that it's bad that children had horrible working conditions in the early 1800s in England. At this point, go ahead and pause the video, write your paragraph 2, content knowledge. Right, if you're coming back from having paused the video, it looks like we're done, but we're actually not. There's one more step that you need to take, and you always do need to take the step if you have the time. Most tests should have a criteria for success printed under the question. That means like where your points are coming from. And ideally, you'll have enough time to reread your answer while looking at these criteria for success and pretending like you're the meanest grader in the world and make sure that you have given that grader every reason to award you all of the points. If you don't have that kind of time, at the bare minimum, what you need to do is to look at what you wrote about for paragraph 2 and make sure that it matches what you said you were going to write about in the thesis. Then do the same thing for paragraph 1. Look at what you actually wrote about for paragraph 1 and make sure it matches what you said you were going to write about in the thesis. The reason for that is that often, if people don't spend time intentionally and purposefully creating a strong thesis, they'll start writing and then they'll have an idea and then they'll go with a completely different set of reasons for content knowledge than they said they were going to talk about in their thesis. And that happens, but the problem is if you do that, you don't get credit for that whole second paragraph because it doesn't match what you said you were arguing. The way to fix that, though, is go back and change the thesis statement. So if I had, an epiphany halfway through writing paragraph 1, and actually I want to write about pollution in the Industrial Revolution, and I wrote a whole thing about, pollution being bad and that's why the Industrial Revolution's bad, I would just have to go back up to the thesis, cross that out if it's on paper or delete it if it's on a computer, and then change it to what I actually wrote about. So that I can get full credit for everything. This is something that a lot of students lose a lot of points because they didn't do, even though it's not a super time-consuming step. All right, finally, let me show you where the point breakdown is. In this response, you get 1 point for the claim, as long as it's specific and it says the Industrial Revolution, it has the topic of what you're talking about. And then you get 1 point for identifying 2 pieces of evidence that will become paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. That's 2 points. You will get 1 point total if you have a topic sentence for paragraph 1, a topic sentence for paragraph 2, and in paragraph 1, you cited the specific document that you're going to quote. That's the writing point. It's just for clarity of writing, but it's one that you don't actually have to know a whole lot in order to do. It's just formatting. So make sure that you're formatting things correctly. So far 3 points for the writing. You get 1 point for correctly identifying a quote that in fact supports your thesis. You get 1 point for adding context to that quote and 1 point for adding reasoning to all of that. If you stop here, you have a passing score. But passing's not good enough. We want to be perfect, right? So paragraph 2, that topic sentence contributes to that 1 writing point. You get 1 point for identifying facts from content knowledge that support your thesis, but that add information to them. You can't just repeat the one thing you said in your thesis. You have to, flesh that out a bit. You get a 2nd point for adding even more descriptive detail. And like before, that could be a definition, it could be cause and effect, it could be compare and contrast, anything specific. And then finally, you get a 9th point for reasoning. And then that's a perfect free response. Thank you for participating in this tutorial. I hope that this time I successfully shared my screen and had the sound on, because the first 2 times I recorded this, I didn't. Okay, bye students.